There's a line you've probably heard from a couple married 50 or 60 years, "We just didn't quit." And the first time you hear it, it sounds like wisdom. The second time, it starts to sound like something else entirely. Meet Alex and Michelle Kowalski. Married 61 years, still living in the same house in Youngstown, Ohio, where they raised 4 kids and buried 1 dog named Captain. Alex worked the same steel mill job for 34 years. Michelle ran the household, raised the children, and, by her own admission, ran Alex too. They hold hands in interviews. They finish each other's sentences. They are, in every visible way, the thing we're all supposedly searching for. And I mean it when I say, I love them. Their love is real. Their loyalty is stunning. The fact that they still choose each other at 84 and 81, that means something. But here's what I also know, their marriage was shaped by a world that no longer exists. Michelle didn't leave, in part, because in 1963 leaving wasn't a real option, not financially, not socially, not in a Catholic neighborhood in northeastern Ohio where divorce was spoken about the way illness was, in whispers and with shame. Alex didn't go to couples therapy because couples therapy was not something men of his generation did, or were even permitted to consider without risking their identity. The advice they give us was forged in circumstances we have largely, thankfully, dismantled, and we need to be honest about that before we hand it to the next generation as gospel. This video is not a takedown of Alex and Michelle. This is a translation. We're going to honor exactly what they got right, and there is a lot they got right, and we are going to update what time, research, and a more equitable world have asked us to revise. Because the worst thing we can do with real wisdom is apply it without thinking. And the second worst thing is throw it away because the packaging looks dated. By the end of this, you'll have 5 relationship principles drawn directly from their 61 years together, each one stress-tested against modern psychology, named for what it actually is, and stripped of the parts that only worked because women had fewer choices and men were never asked to feel anything. That's the version of their wisdom worth keeping. The first thing Alex told us, the thing he said before we even finished setting up the camera, was that the secret to their marriage was never putting yourself first. Let's start there, because that sentence is doing a lot of complicated work. Alex said it plainly, the way men of his generation say most true things, without decoration, without explanation, as if the meaning should be obvious to anyone paying attention. You can't be selfish and be married. The moment you start thinking about what you want more than what we need, that's when it falls apart. Michelle nodded from across the kitchen table and added, almost quietly, you learn to want what's good for the family. After a while, it becomes the same thing. That last line is the one worth pausing on, because it reveals something Alex's version doesn't, that for Michelle, the dissolution of personal want wasn't a sacrifice she made. It was a survival adaptation she dressed up as virtue. She grew up in an era when a woman's desires were not considered separate from her household's desires. The merging wasn't chosen. It was required. And when something is required long enough, we call it wisdom. Here's what the research says. Psychologist Kristen Neff, whose work on self-compassion has reshaped how therapists think about relationships, makes a distinction that Alex and Michelle's generation never had language for: the difference between selfishness and self-regard. Selfishness is zero-sum, your gain at my expense. Self-regard is what allows you to show up for another person without depleting yourself into resentment. Neff's research consistently shows that people with higher self-compassion are actually more generous in their relationships, not less, because they're not running on empty while pretending they're full. Alex wasn't wrong that selfishness corrodes a marriage. He was wrong about the antidote. The updated principle isn't never put yourself first, it's know yourself well enough to know what you actually need, so that your giving is sustainable and not secretly a debt you're collecting. The couples who last aren't the ones who erased themselves. They're the ones who remained legible to each other, and to themselves. When we asked Alex and Michelle about conflict, Alex leaned forward like he'd been waiting for the question. "Oh, we fought. Don't let anybody tell you a good marriage means no fighting. We had some real ones. But we always came back. Always. You wake up the next morning and you come back." Michelle laughed at something she didn't say out loud. Later, off camera, she told us there were years she came back because the alternative felt impossible. She said it without bitterness, which is its own kind of complicated. Alex and Michelle came of age before the field of couples therapy had a coherent framework for conflict repair. The advice "always come back" emerged from a culture where persistence was the only tool available, where there were no therapists to call, no books to read, no language for why the fight kept happening or what was underneath it. What they were intuiting, imperfectly, instinctively, is what John Gottman would later identify in his decades of research at the University of Washington as the critical importance of repair attempts. Gottman found that it isn't the absence of conflict that predicts relationship longevity, it's whether couples can interrupt a negative cycle before it calcifies. A repair attempt can be as small as a touch on the arm mid-argument, a moment of humor, or simply saying, "I don't want to fight like this." Alex's coming back the next morning was a repair attempt. It worked. But it worked slowly, and it left a lot of unprocessed material in the walls of that Youngstown house. The part Alex left out, the part the research fills in, is that repair only holds if the underlying pattern is eventually named. Otherwise, you're not resolving conflict, you're rescheduling it. The updated principle, coming back, matters. But coming back and saying what the fight was actually about matters more. Loyalty without honesty is just endurance. And endurance, on its own, is not a relationship strategy. It's a coping mechanism. Alex said this one with particular conviction, the kind that tells you it's less a philosophy and more a scar. What happens in this house stays in this house. You don't go running to your mother, you don't tell your friends your business. You handle it between the two of you. That's respect. Michelle agreed, though she added one quiet amendment, your priest. You could always talk to your priest. This belief was forged in a community culture where privacy was not just preference, it was social armor. In Alex's Youngstown, a man whose wife talked about their marriage to neighbors wasn't just embarrassed. He was diminished. The boundary around the marriage wasn't about protecting intimacy. It was about protecting reputation. Those are not the same thing, and conflating them cost a lot of couples, especially women, the outside support they desperately needed and were actively discouraged from seeking. Here's where I'll say it plainly, this is the piece of their wisdom that does the most damage when passed down unexamined. Research from Dr. James Pennybaker at the University of Texas has demonstrated across decades of study that emotional disclosure, telling our story to a trusted other, is one of the most powerful tools for psychological processing we have. Couples who have no outside support structure are not more unified. They are more fragile. They become each other's only resource, which is a pressure no two people can sustainably bear. The absence of outside voices doesn't protect a marriage. It insulates it from the feedback that might actually help it grow. What they got wrong, privacy as a value is not the problem. Isolation as a strategy is. There is a profound difference between protecting the intimacy of your marriage, choosing carefully who you confide in, speaking about your partner with dignity, and treating your relationship as a closed system where no outside oxygen is permitted. The first is wisdom. The second is how problems fester into crises. The updated principle: guard the intimacy of your marriage fiercely, and let 2 or 3 trusted people in, completely. Not to judge. Not to take sides. But because love was never meant to be witnessed by no one. It's also worth naming something structural here. Alex and Michelle had a priest, a parish, and a neighborhood that functioned as a low-stakes social container, people who knew them across decades, who held context for their lives. That kind of sustained community is increasingly rare. Fewer than a third of Americans report having a close friend they can discuss personal problems with, according to recent Pew data. When Alex says, "handle it between the 2 of you," he's describing a couple embedded in a web of informal support that most modern couples simply do not have. His advice assumes a village. Many of us are working without one. This one landed differently than the others. Alex said it slowly, like he was reading it off something inside himself. "When I married Michelle, that was a choice I made. And every morning I have to make it again. You don't get to coast on the decision. You make it every day." This is the point where the competitor videos usually just play soft music and let the line breathe for 30 seconds. I understand why. It's genuinely beautiful. And it is also doing something subtle that's worth naming. The Choose Them Everyday framework emerged from a theology of marriage as covenant, a tradition where the choosing was a daily act of will, elevated above feeling, above circumstance, above the self. In Alex's worldview, love is not something you fall into. It is something you do, regardless of how you feel. That is a real insight. Feeling-based relationships that abandon ship the moment connection becomes difficult are not relationships, they're extended auditions. Psychologist Robert Sternberg's triangular theory of love identifies 3 components that sustain long-term relationships: intimacy, passion, and commitment. Alex is describing commitment in its purest form. What Sternberg's research also shows is that commitment without intimacy, without the ongoing emotional knowledge of who your partner actually is, right now, not who they were when you chose them, eventually becomes what he calls empty love. Loyal, present, and quietly hollow. The "what they got wrong" moment here is subtle but important. Choosing someone every day is only meaningful if you also see them every day, if the choosing is responsive to who they are becoming, not just who they were when you made the original decision. Alex's framing, taken literally, can justify staying in a marriage that has fundamentally changed, where the person you're loyally choosing no longer resembles the person standing in front of you, and neither does the version of yourself doing the choosing. The updated principle: choose them every day, and make sure you know who you're choosing. Commitment without curiosity isn't devotion. It's inertia with better PR. Michelle said this one. Alex had stepped out of the room, and something shifted in her, the way people shift when the person they've spent 61 years performing wellness for is briefly out of earshot. She folded her hands on the table and said, "We lost a child." "Did you know that?" "A boy. 1971, and I don't know how I think we just held on to each other because there was nothing else to hold on to. I don't know if that's strength or if that's just what you do when you have no other choice. But we're still here." She said it without looking for a response. It wasn't a lesson. It was a testimony. Alex and Michelle lost their son, Michael, at 4 months old. They didn't go to grief counseling, It didn't exist in the way it does now, not for a working-class Catholic family in 1971. They didn't talk about it publicly for decades. By their own account, they barely talked about it with each other for the first several years. They moved through the loss the way their generation moved through most unbearable things, forward and together, and mostly in silence. What Michelle is describing maps almost precisely onto what therapist and researcher Dr. Susan Johnson, the founder of emotionally focused therapy, calls a bonding event through crisis. A moment so destabilizing that the only attachment figure available becomes the person beside you, and that shared surviving creates a bond that is both profound and, without eventual processing, potentially load-bearing in ways that aren't visible until much later. EFT research shows that couples who survive major loss together often report deeper felt security, and also more unresolved grief, more emotional distance built from avoidance, more things that never got said because the saying felt like reopening something that had finally, barely, closed. What Michelle called holding on was real love. It was also the only tool they had. The updated principle, surviving together, is the beginning, not the destination. The couples who truly heal after loss are the ones who eventually turn toward each other about it, not just beside each other through it. Alex and Michelle's marriage worked, genuinely worked, produced love and loyalty and 61 years of showing up, but when you look at the mechanism underneath each piece of advice they give, you find the same structure every time. They found a way to make external pressure do the work that internal connection was supposed to do. Never put yourself first. The external pressure of social expectation and economic necessity kept them oriented toward the unit. Always come back. The external pressure of divorce stigma and community accountability ensured repair. Don't air your dirty laundry. The external wall of privacy kept the marriage self-contained and, in a strange way, self-reliant. Choose them every day. The external framework of religious covenant made the choice feel less optional, which meant it required less active tending. And surviving loss, the external force of grief that left them no one but each other. What I want to name, and I think this is the thing no one is saying clearly, is that Alex and Michelle's marriage was architecturally supported in ways that most modern marriages simply are not. The scaffolding was built into the culture. They didn't have to engineer commitment from scratch every year. The world around them held the structure while they lived inside it. And then we dismantled most of that scaffolding, rightly, because a lot of it was also holding up systems that were hurting people, particularly women. And we handed modern couples a set of principles that were designed to work inside a structure that no longer exists, and said, good luck. That is the inheritance. And it is both a gift and an incomplete instruction manual. Modern couples have something Alex and Michelle didn't: genuine choice. Michelle can leave. Alex is allowed to cry. They can go to therapy without shame and read about attachment theory on their phones at midnight and text their best friend when the marriage is struggling. The freedom is real and it is enormous. But freedom without the internal skills to use it wisely, without the capacity for self-knowledge, emotional honesty, and chosen rather than coerced commitment, produces a different kind of fragility. One that looks like liberation and sometimes is just a more sophisticated form of avoidance. Modern couples are navigating something genuinely new, a relationship culture where almost nothing external enforces staying, which means everything depends on what you've built inside. Social media hands you a daily highlight reel of what your relationship is supposedly competing against. Economic instability means the practical partnership is under constant renegotiation. Gender roles that once sorted labor automatically now require ongoing conversation, which is healthier and also much harder. And therapy, blessedly, is less stigmatized, which means there are fewer excuses for not doing the work, and also fewer places to hide from the fact that you haven't been doing it. Alex and Michelle survived because the world held them in place long enough to accidentally build something real. Your task is harder, to build something real on purpose, in a world that will not hold you in place at all. Before we left Alex and Michelle's house, Alex walked us to the door, the way men of his generation always walk you to the door, like seeing you out is a final act of hospitality they take seriously. And he stopped at the threshold, looked back at Michelle still sitting at the kitchen table, and said nothing. Just looked. The way you look at something you've looked at 10,000 times and somehow still see. I've thought about that moment more than anything he said on camera. What Alex and Michelle represent is not a blueprint. It is a proof of concept, evidence that two people can remain tethered to each other across 6 decades of change and loss and ordinariness and still feel, in a quiet kitchen in Youngstown, Ohio, like the right answer to each other. That is real. That is worth something enormous. The cost of pretending their world and ours are identical is that we take their wisdom and apply it like a transplant without checking for compatibility. And the cost of dismissing them entirely, of deciding that because their era was flawed their love was too, is that we lose the only long-term data we have. We need them. We just need to read them correctly. If you watched this and felt something tighten in your chest at the part about choosing someone every day without really seeing them, sit with that. Not with guilt. With curiosity. Most of us are somewhere inside the tension this video is describing, wanting the depth of what Alex and Michelle built, living in a world that requires we build it differently, and not always sure we have the tools. That uncertainty is not a flaw in you. It is an honest response to a genuinely hard problem. The couples who figure it out are rarely the ones who had it easiest. They're the ones who stayed curious the longest. Here's what I'd ask you to carry out of this, in the updated form, not what they said, but what they meant, translated for where we actually live. Know yourself well enough that your giving is sustainable, not a debt you're secretly keeping count of. Repair the fight, yes, but eventually name what the fight was actually about. Let 2 or 3 people into your marriage fully, not to referee, but to witness. Choose your partner every day and stay genuinely curious about who they're becoming, because loyalty without curiosity is just habit in a good coat. And when the unbearable comes, and it will, survive it together, and then turn toward each other about it, not just beside each other through it. Those 5, in that order, are a more honest inheritance than anything nostalgia alone could give you. I want to ask you something in the comments, and I mean it as a real question, not a prompt. Which one of these landed hardest for you, and do you know why? Because I find that the point that stings is almost never random. It tends to be the one that names something you've been circling without quite saying out loud. If you're comfortable, share it. And if you have an elder couple in your life, a grandparent, a neighbor, someone whose long marriage you've watched up close, tell me what they always said. The thing they repeated like it was the whole answer. I want to hear it, and I want to think about it with you. If this kind of thinking is what you're looking for, the kind that honors real experience and refuses to leave the hard questions on the floor, then stay. There's more of this work to do together. The wisdom was never in the length of their marriage, it was in what they were willing to survive for it, and our job, now, is to choose that same depth without requiring their suffering to get us there.